Welcome. I'm Dr. Gary Zamet, President and CEO at Clinilabs, a full-service contract research organization that is dedicated to the study of CNS therapeutics. And with me today is Nicole Latimer, CEO of Medrio, an e-clinical software company that facilitates the conduct of clinical trials. Nicole, welcome.
Hey Gary, thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
You've been CEO of Medrio for the past 5 years. What led you into this kind of work?
Well, Gary, I joined in the middle of the pandemic, and it was really a very inspiring time to do so. It really felt like the opportunity to help open up the world again because we were all stuck at home. And I've really, really enjoyed being the CEO of Medrio and working with this team. We have the opportunity in a very small way, but an important way, to shorten the clinical research process through the use of technology and ultimately speed life-saving therapies so that they can get into the hands of patients faster.
Is this what you envisioned doing when you were an undergraduate and then graduate student at the University of Michigan, or were you thinking about something else?
I, you know, there's no way that I was thinking about the specifics, right? I probably not the specifics of the industry, definitely not the specifics of the company or even the role, but the overall impact, the ability to have an impact on patients' lives, the ability to do something good, the ability to really lead an organization and work together to help uh, advance a larger cause. I absolutely had that in mind. And then, after all, when you're a Wolverine, you're one of the leaders and the best.
All right. So let's talk about some of the technologies that are being applied in clinical trials today in general terms and what you think their real impact is.
We've seen a lot of technology being adopted across the last 2 decades and really across the entire clinical research process. Everything from protocol development to recruitment of patients to what Medrio does well, which is the capture of data during the research study. And now that we're collecting more and more data as protocols are becoming more complex, it's really important that we continue to adopt technology because you can't manage the exponential complexity with just manual processes.
When you say you can't manage, what does that mean? Just in terms of volume or in terms of data accuracy and quality?
It's actually both. Primarily, it's difficult to handle the increasing volume of data with just manual processes. In the last 6 years alone, we've seen a 35% increase in the number of data variables just in phase 1 studies, which are supposed to be the shortest and easiest phases to complete. And so when you have that amount of exponential increase in data volume, it's very hard to do it with just manual processes, and it's not cost effective to do it. You don't want to see an increase in time or cost associated with clinical research when it already takes tens of millions of dollars to get a therapy into patients' hands. And with regard to quality, what we see is technological capture of data is substantially higher quality than paper-based. You have timestamps, you have passwords, you have an electronic trail of when the data is entered, when it is touched, when it is monitored, how it is changed. You don't get that kind of automated trail on paper. And so you have a better sense of where high quality data is.
What you're saying certainly fits with what we're seeing in clinical trials with the number of inclusion and exclusion criteria increasing, the number of both core elements and non-core elements going into protocols. There's just more and more that needs to be done with every project. Now, I was raised in the days of paper CRFs. We had to print real hard with black ink on triplicate forms so that monitors could come and collect one page and we'd keep a page. Another page would, I presume, be filed with a regulatory authority. Um, then we started getting into electronic case report forms and now e-source. What's that transition?
So, what we're seeing today is that the transition from paper based CRFs to electronic CRFs or ECRFs within what we call an EDC, an electronic data capture system, or a CDMS, a clinical data management system. Those are the acronyms that people use today in the industry. That's almost entirely complete. There are very few studies today that are actually working off of paper. Given the volume, as you mentioned, Gary, the volume of data that's being collected, it's really hard to just do things on paper today. And for many, the next transition is going to eSource. It's taking that EDC or CDMS, it's having it on a tablet. And as a clinician, you are working directly with the patient and you're entering that information into the tablet, onto those ECRF forms right there. No longer writing them on paper and then transferring them and double data entering them into the EDC. That's the big transition I think people are going to make. And it's going to rely on software that can be fit into those clinical workflows.
And I'm presuming that eSource is not simply a reference to clinician notes and information that clinicians enter, but it could relate to electronic informed consent forms, ePro, patient reported outcomes, and things like that. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. eSource is really thinking about source data. So, where does the data originate? And capturing that data automatically, uh, digitally, and putting it into the EDC or CDMS as a flow of data as opposed to someone manually entering that information. So it could be information coming from labs or imaging or an electronic health record or devices and sensors that patients are wearing.
Do patients and investigators need specialized devices for this, or can this be done on a laptop, iPad, or mobile device?
Yeah, the best software out there is what we call responsive software. And that's where you're building the code to respond to any screen that it's being used off of. So it could be a tablet, it could be a laptop, it could even be a phone. Right? The best software is creating a workflow that is very similar to the workflows that we all use every day outside of our clinical life.
And you mentioned EHR. What's the status of integration of EHR with eSource?
So we are just starting to get into more and more organizations thinking about how do I tap into the EHR data and use that data to understand what's going on with patients, to collect the information. And what we know from studies is that about 75% of all the data that you would collect in a clinical trial is already present within that patient's EHR. And so if you can tap into the EHR, collect that information, draw it straight into the EDC, CDMS, then that's a huge win, right? That reduces the amount of data you have to collect. It reduces the monitoring and the querying that you would have to do. The issue, of course, is tapping into that EHR data and really being able to bring it in. We're seeing more and more organizations starting to go down this direction. Primarily, it's the larger pharmaceutical companies that are taking up the charge and starting this work. But pretty much it's going to become standard across the next several years. And we'll see more of the pioneering and mid-sized life sciences companies be able to take advantage of this kind of you know access to great patient data.
That seems exciting to me because I could envision being able to query the database in a large healthcare system to identify patients who might be appropriate for entry into a clinical trial.
Absolutely. And that's already being done by a number of the patient recruitment companies that are out there. They do have access to EHRs. They're able to query and look for patients that meet both the inclusion and exclusion criteria and identify those patients or possible patients and use that information to recruit successfully. I also see EHR data as being key to not having to double data enter critical information that everybody collects. Imagine the demographics and the vital signs all coming over directly instead of having to enter them a second time.
Now, uh, beyond collecting clinical data, perhaps more traditional types of clinical data in electronic ways, are there other ways that technology has been impacting the conduct of clinical trials?
As I mentioned, technology has definitely helped with the recruitment of patients. So being able to go and look through large sets of data, identifying patients that fit within the inclusion but are not excluded from the exclusion criteria, so you could go and recruit them. We're also seeing organizations that are starting to use AI to filter through the thousands of protocols that have been used across years and years of research and identifying, what are those inclusion and exclusion criteria that have facilitated great trials that have led to success. What kinds of data collection has been most successful in getting to final approval? And so all of that information can then inform protocol development. So more and more going in, tapping into the historical protocols, analyzing them, and providing great suggestions around the development of protocols for organizations. And then finally, I'm seeing technology on the analysis side. We know that AI and machine learning, the critical use case is large data sets and finding outlier information and inlier information, right? That is the classic use case. And finding those outliers, that helps data managers with understanding where should they take a second look at data. And of course, finding inliers where you're seeing repeated patterns of data over and over again. That's always a pink flag for potential fraud or mistakes. And so, again, points those data managers to, hey, here's an area where I need to take a deeper look and where I should be spending more time to ensure we get it right.
I've seen a lot of tech applications that might improve the quality or compliance of a clinical trial. For example, applications that confirm dosing using video, or applications that actually can be embedded into a capsule that will confirm that the subject has actually taken a dose. And still, even other applications used to confirm subject identity through facial recognition or fingerprinting. Are you seeing those being integrated more into trials?
I am not on a broad basis at this time. But I am seeing a lot of interest in medication adherence. That shouldn't surprise anybody. Medication adherence is probably the biggest issue that the pharmaceutical industry has. And so you want to make sure, especially during clinical research, that medications are being taken and they're being taken according to the protocol schedule. So, yes, you're absolutely right. We're seeing things like automated pill bottles where it tells you when the cap has been opened and therefore potentially taken, or it automatically registers the weights of the pill bottles to demonstrate that, yes, a pill has actually been taken out of it. The digitized pills where it will tell you the pill has actually been ingested into the patient. We're seeing lots and lots of those technologies, the facial scans for recognition, some of those. But as I said, not predominant. I think people are testing them out. I think they are looking for ways to ensure that there's adherence, to ensure that they can improve quality and safety, make really safeguard the data that they are building in their trial. And that's because the data coming out of a clinical research study for many organizations, for the pioneering and mid-sized organizations out there, it is the second greatest asset that they will have in their company. The greatest asset is whatever their therapy is. The second greatest is the data that they collect in that trial, because they're going to use that data to raise more money, to get regulatory approval, and ultimately to commercialize their therapy.
So all of these technologies can really improve the clinical trials process, make it better, and make the quality of the data better. But is there a, a, a question about return on investment? Do sponsors, pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, do they have to be concerned about the cost? And are they confident they're going to see a return on that investment?
When you really lay out the return on investment from these technologies, what you see is there's often a misperception that, say, paper based data collection is better or that the traditional ways of doing things are better. What we often find is the misperception comes with regard to when costs occur. When you use technology, often there's an upfront cost. And so it's perceived at the beginning, wow, this is so much more expensive than the way we used to do things because there is that upfront cost. But when you really look at the overall total cost of ownership for each of the processes, what you find is that there are significant costs on the back end with traditional ways. And I'll use paper based data collection as an example. On the back end with paper based, you're going to see more monitoring time, more data cleansing time, more data analysis time. You're going to incur things that you wouldn't incur with technology, like the storage of paper for the 7 to 25 years that you need to keep the data around, depending on where your trial has been conducted. Those are things that people don't tend to think about. But as I said, when you take the entire process, you take all the costs across that process, technology ends up being much more cost effective. And when you take the increased quality of data that comes through technology capture, it's no question. There's absolutely no question. And so sponsors can see that. What they then need to do is make sure that they're helping CROs and sites and investigators to optimize the use of that technology so that everybody benefits.
Yeah. So it's not simply comparing the cost of uh, paper versus some type of technology at the beginning of a trial. It's considering total costs and including those back end costs for cleaning data, monitoring data, data errors, correction of data errors, and maybe in a worst case scenario, I would imagine having real problems with the data that didn't get identified because things were missed on paper.
Oh, absolutely. Illegibility is a big issue. We've seen coffee stains that obscure information. Right? There are lots of things that can go wrong. When you have technology, yes, there are definitely glitches in technology, but a lot of the benefits from technology come from the fact that you can track everything that is happening, right? That timestamp, the passwords that you know who is entering the data, you know who is looking at the data, you know who's changing the data. Even if data gets erased, often there are logs on the back end where it can be recovered. There's much more opportunity to ensure that data is safeguarded and that it's high quality.
Now, in my area of clinical trials in the CNS space, we have a core laboratory where we um, aggregate data from multi-center clinical trials, and we process the data in our data center, and it's all machine data. So it's EEG, PSG, ECG, and so on. And we started with PSG or polysomnography, and when we began, those polysomnograms were on paper. We'd have these big giant boxes of paper and these giant tracings, and we would of course read them on paper. And then in the early 2000s, people started moving to digital systems. Um, it was kind of a slow movement to the digital system. And then it seemed like overnight we hit a tipping point where everything went digital. And I'm kind of wondering, in terms of the development of these technologies or the adoption of these technologies, Is it a slow moving adoption, or have we hit a tipping point already, perhaps, where things are now squarely digital?
Well, I think as we enter the 21st century, right, we have seen massive digital adoption, not only in healthcare, but across nearly every industry. And so, yes, we are seeing more and more technology adoption everywhere that we go. Uh, Within clinical research, probably the biggest factor around technology adoption came during the pandemic. Right? We were all stuck at home. We wanted this critical research, this ability to help patients. We wanted that to continue. And so there was tremendous adoption of technologies during that year and a half. We haven't seen a slip back. So it's not as if people have abandoned those technologies that they have adopted. But we haven't necessarily seen that kind of adoption rate continue. And I'm a little bit worried about the current situation, right? We're in a little bit of economic turmoil right now. And when you see that kind of turmoil, you see very conservative thinking. You see people not wanting to push beyond their comfort zone or to make big changes. And so, even though there are some great technologies out there that can improve clinical research, that can make it more efficient, we are seeing people question whether or not it's worth it, whether or not they're willing to do it, given all the other uncertainty that they're facing right now.
So you mentioned the pandemic, and that's interesting because one of the things that we saw as an organization during the pandemic is sponsor willingness to replace in-clinic visits with remote video visits. And I think I anticipated that we'd see more and more activity toward decentralized clinical trials. Do you see that happening, or has that kind of slowed a bit since the pandemic?
I think that the concept of a truly decentralized trial has slowed a bit since the pandemic. And when I talk about a truly decentralized trial, I'm talking about 100% of the activities being outside of the clinic. Yes, that was well used across the pandemic, but not as well used today. It's not because of the technology, right? The technologies are there. We're seeing folks use it. At Medrio, we have a number of organizations that do in home research visits. So they have nurses and other clinicians coming into the home, working with patients. They're facilitating televisits with investigators. But it's more so now in terms of a hybrid approach rather than a truly decentralized. And hybrid means, some of those visits you're coming into the clinic, you're face to face with that investigator, and some of the visits they're being done more remotely from your home. Or even more and more, we're seeing some mobile vans. So people are bringing the office to your driveway and you're walking out and participating in your visit in that van. What we've learned is it's kind of natural human behavior. Every once in a while, you want to be face to face with someone. And I think patients feel that way about their physicians. Yes, it's great and it's convenient to have a televisit, but maybe once a year or twice a year, I actually want to be face to face because you don't necessarily get all the communication through body language that you do through just a televisit.
Yeah, and it seems to me that hybridization of clinical trial protocols can kind of give us the best of both worlds. The efficiencies of telehealth visits or things like that, and also the benefit of one-on-one face-to-face visits with the investigator or clinical staff.
I absolutely agree. What we are seeing work best in the hybrid research visit model is when there's flexibility, because some patients are absolutely fine having people come into their home and conducting visits with them there. Others are not as comfortable with that. And so, what's worked best and what we've seen as the most successful model is when patients can actually choose which of those visits they want in their home, which of those they want in the clinic, and being able to dictate based on their preferences. It's a truly patient centered model, which I think is what we're all kind of striving for in this industry.
That's really novel. That the patient can kind of choose the course that they'll take through a clinical trial protocol.
It probably also enhances the retention of patients because you're better accommodating what it is that or how they want to participate.
One question I want to ask you before we close relates to patient safety, which of course is always our primary concern in the world of clinical trials. Are there aspects of technology that can enhance patient or subject safety while they're participating?
So, aspects of patient safety, I think there are definitely pieces of technology that would help with improving the ability to report any adverse issues. The most promising is sensors and devices that patients could be wearing or using. So we've seen everything from Bluetooth scales to Bluetooth blood pressure cuffs to thermometers. And then, of course, there are things like smart rings or smart watches that patients are very, very familiar with. What's great about these wearables and these devices in the home is you can get immediate information. So you can be monitoring patients and looking at the data on a regular basis and intervening if there is anything that is wrong or an issue. The other good thing is that since many of these devices and sensors are things that patients thinks are cool or they think that they already have some familiarity with, they're much more likely to adopt them and use them and wear them, and you're going to get real-time information. So if they are having an issue, you can be watching it and you can intervene and you can report on any of those safety issues immediately.
Yeah, I totally agree. We've seen an increase in the use of wearables in clinical protocols, also willingness on the part of the patients to adopt their use. Years ago, if you asked somebody to wear, say, an actigraph, it was larger than the size of a deck of cards, and it was very obtrusive. And people would get dressed to go out for the evening, and they'd be wearing this big clunky thing. And now these things are very unobtrusive, and if you do see them, they're kind of cool looking, and people seem to like wear them.
Absolutely. And if you can give them access to some of the information, I think patients are more and more interested in understanding their own health info and health data. I think that encourages them to participate and wear the sensors and devices even more.
So here we are in 2025. Where do you think we're going to be in terms of clinical trial technology in 2030? Where will we be 5 years from now?
Yeah, well, it's always hard to predict the future, but I would say in 5 years, there are a couple of things that we're going to see. The first is going to be the incorporation of AI, artificial intelligence. And when I talk about AI, I'm talking about, generative AI, which is things like Chat GPT, but I'm also talking about greater use of things like machine learning. I don't think that AI is going to come in and replace any clinical research jobs tomorrow, but I do think that we're increasingly going to see AI be used to identify outliers and inliers within large data sets. I think that we're going to see large data sets being analyzed using AI, first with someone going in and reconciling that information, reviewing that information, ensuring that it is correct. And then ultimately, a lot of the reports and the lists and the tables, all of those are going to be drafted by AI. As I said, I don't think it's going to replace people immediately. I do think it's going to give people drafts. It's going to point them in the direction of what they should look at. We are going to need a human in the loop to make sure that the information is 100% spot on. But increasingly, in the data management world, we're going to see more and more use of AI. The other thing I think we're going to see is, as we talked about a little bit earlier, that incorporation of EHR data into clinical research. It's such a treasure trove of information. People are worried that EHR data, there's a lot of unstructured data, a lot of notes, physicians' notes within an EHR, but there's also a ton of structured data that is easy to get. And so there's no reason for us to be duplicating demographics or allergy information or medication lists when that information is already ready in the EHR and could easily be ported over into a research database. So I think 5 years from now, that's going to be pretty standard that we're tapping into this treasure trove of information rather than asking for that information all over again from patients.
It's an exciting time in the field of clinical trial technology. I personally am very glad that I'm around at this time in the evolution of all of this, because I do think, and I think we would agree that this technology will not only accelerate the rate at which we can perform clinical trials, but that it is quite likely to increase the likelihood of approvals, increase the rate of approvals as time goes on. And as you said at the top of this session, getting treatments into the hands of people who need them.
I 100% agree. It's super exciting and it's really inspirational. I love to see when we have studies that go faster than we anticipated because you know that the more that they're able to study, the faster they're able to go, the quicker they can get through the entire process and bring something to a patient that they absolutely need to mitigate their symptoms or in some cases even cure their underlying disease. And that's what drives us every day at Medrio. We're on a mission to help save 100 million lives. And so every day we get up and say, how can our technology help this research to go more efficiently, more effectively, and help patients?
Well, thank you very much for talking with me today. I will look forward to following up with you at some point in the near future to see if some of the predictions we talked about actually come true. I bet they do. But Nicole, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Gary.